All right. It is 3:32 p.m. on December 16th, 2024, and we will go ahead and get the December meeting of the Long-Term Revenue Advisory Council going. The first item on the agenda is roll call, so I'll just go through alphabetical order. And if you're present, just say aye. Lorenzo Boyd.
Aye.
Ryan Coleman.
Aye.
Nancy Cross.
Aye.
Jason Fletcher. I see him here. He may be busy. I'm going to go ahead and mark him down. I do see him. Let's see. We've got Sam Murphy.
Here.
Linda Nguyen is not able to be with us today. Paul Payne. Looks like he had to hop off. Danielle Scott Parker.
Aye.
Mark Stoff.
Aye.
Tracy Werner.
Aye.
Great. And let's see, I believe Treasurer Lane is also unable to be with us today. And then we'll do ex officio members, Assessor Dauphin.
Aye.
Great. And then Rebecca Perry Glickstein.
I know she's in transit, but should be joining late.
Wonderful. Thanks for that. All right. Well, that is the first item on the agenda. The second item on the agenda is the review and approval of prior meeting minutes. If everyone wants to take, oh, there she is. I see her. I'll mark her down. Rebecca, hello. And then if folks want to take a minute to scroll through the minutes, if you haven't already, we'll let that happen for about a minute or two, and then we'll entertain a motion to approve. If there's any amendments to be made, happy to hear those as well.
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes as presented.
Great. Is there
Second.
all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Great. All right. The minutes have been approved. And we will move on to agenda item 3, which is the informational briefing on city revenue limitations and risks. I will go ahead and pull up the PowerPoint and get ready to share that if you all bear with me. Okay. All right, so this week's topic is city revenue limitations and risks with 3 specific areas of focus: revenue-related limitations in state law, revenue-related state legislative landscape, and then any other areas of fiscal limitation or risk for the city that are helpful to know about. And as far as the why consider these, of course, as a municipality, we do face preemption. State law and the state constitution do contain a number of laws that do limit or instruct or otherwise prescribe several aspects of how we as a city can think about raising revenue. There is a lot of intersectionality not just with taxes, but with other kinds of revenue generation as well, to be mindful of as we're considering strategies moving forward. So this will be a review of all of that to help us get a better lay of the land as we're considering some of the great information that's already been shared with us earlier. So starting off with a bit of an overview in terms of where can municipalities generally obtain revenue. And this is rooted in state constitution and state law. There's a number of different kinds of revenue that cities can raise. You, of course, have taxes, including assessed property taxes, sales taxes, and earnings or income taxes. There's franchise taxes and license fees for if you want to operate, a business. There are fines and penalties that the city is able to tack onto an ordinance as part of the exercise of its police power for violations. Importantly with that, by and large, for the most part, the city is currently limited to $500 cap on fine, although the voters have chosen to authorize fines in excess for a handful of circumstances, but that limitation is currently found in our city charter, so just a good thing to be aware of. We have what's commonly referred to as impact fees and fees for municipal services. If you're, doing some sort of paperwork or other engaging with the city government for a service, like a building inspection or building permit or getting a copy of the document, those are the kinds of things that we think about when we talk about impact fees and fees for municipal services. We've also got grants from the state or federal government. We refer to those as revenue sharing or cost sharing arrangements. Typically in those, the federal state government will lay out a match and the city will have to provide that in order to draw down that financial contribution from the state or the feds. There are also certain special assessments that can be levied against properties for certain kinds of local improvements. And then, of course, there's debt borrowing or enabling another entity to borrow money on the city's behalf. We also have the ability to generate revenue from income and profits from the use and sale of municipal money and properties. And then, of course, as a city, we have enterprise funds. Probably the biggest ones you're aware of are water and the airport. And so on each of these kinds of revenue sources, there is an array of state constitutional and state statutory provisions that do set forth parameters for how we can engage those, how we can utilize and apply those. So starting with the Constitution, it does have a general provision stating that taxing powers for constitutional charter cities like us have to be consistent with the Constitution, not limited or denied either by our charter or in statute. And essentially what that means is we can't go wild and either go above and beyond something that's listed in statute and do our own spin. For example, if statute says up to 1% tax, we can't go above 1%. Or if, the Constitution or statute do not allow that kind of tax, we generally are not able to create it on our own. We do also see in the Constitution that's specific to taxes. They have to be uniformly implemented on the same class or subclass of subjects. And class or subclass, an easy example is residential property. So you generally want to, for the same, classes of property within residential, treat them all equally. So just to ensure a bit of fairness and predictability for residents. We've also got certain limitations on the property tax rate, as well as provisions for how municipalities can increase it and the specific targets for that increase, which are libraries, hospitals, public health, recreational grounds that don't include the zoo, and museum purposes. In state law, we also have some important prohibitions and parameters to be mindful of. So some of them get specific on the certain kind of revenue. By way of example, license taxes. We do have a requirement under state law that we cannot impose those unless you're specifically authorized in our charter, or if that power to impose those is in state statute. There are certain kinds of licenses that we cannot create fees for. It's a lot of your social beneficial practices, whether it's religious association, educators, or other individuals who are more seen as providing some sort of public good. And it is important to note that the exemption that state statute places on assessing license fees for teachers also operates to prohibit the city from assessing fees on a charitable or educational school as well. We also have a chapter in state law that squarely pertains to constitutional charter cities, which are us in the city of Kansas City. Some provisions apply to both of us, some apply to one or the other. And so we have that reiteration of that general municipal tax levy of for assessed property valuation, again, reiterating those certain additional allowances, breaking down some of those examples below. We also see in this chapter, importantly, and this of course has been one of the biggest topics of conversation in the city in the past few years, the parameters governing our city's earnings tax. This is where our 1% cap is found, where the requirement to reauthorize it every 5 years is also found. We also find in state law a prohibition against municipalities imposing certain kinds of taxes on telecommunications. That's another limitation to be aware of. And it also governs how and imposes limits on how we can tax merchants and manufacturers. There is a Merchants and Manufacturers Adjustment Board at the city that operates this provision. And in this chapter as well in state law, we also see the authorization, the limit for the city's currently implemented public safety sales tax of 0.5%. Elsewhere in state law, we again see that reiteration of how municipalities can increase that maximum general levy and for what specific kinds of generally public social facing purposes. We also see some allowances for certain city sales taxes that the city has taken advantage of. Capital improvements, transportation sales tax are some great examples. And then on the topic of debt, there's a lot of parameters surrounding that to be mindful of. It's a topic that comes up now and then. The Constitution does contain requirements for how much the city can become indebted. Generally, the city cannot become indebted more than our income and revenue, plus any unencumbered balances for from previous years. It's pretty common sense stuff, but that's where that's found. And then there's different kinds of debt that can be incurred based upon the purpose of the debt. And so proper purpose is one that doesn't conflict with the constitutional or statutory purposes. For a lot of these, a vote is required, certainly for general obligation bonds, a vote is required. And there's certain financial proof that the city has to demonstrate that it can provide for a collection of the annual tax sufficient to pay the interest and principal and to retire them 20 years. So some safeguards are found in the Constitution about debt. And the same thing for revenue obligations, which are targeted towards borrowings to support the revenues of a particular enterprise. So think water and airport. Here, there's no debt limit prescribed in the Constitution, but the governing body is the one that does set forth that, along with conversations with issuers in the bond market and investors. And then there's a third category of debt that is engaged with third parties to benefit specific kinds of services in the city: industrial development, public housing, industrial expansions, land clearance redevelopment, and other similar local agencies. And so the city does have pretty robust infrastructure around all of these programs currently. Another big limitation that comes up often is the limitation of that's called the Hancock Amendment. I'm sure a lot of people here have probably heard of that. It essentially restricts both state and local governments on increasing taxes and other charges applied by local government. Generally prohibits them from increasing or levying them unless it was already authorized without voter approval. One important note is the Hancock Amendment does see a difference between a true fee and a tax masquerading as a fee. In other words, it's generally not supported for a city to implement a fee that operates exactly like a tax in practice. So that's something to be mindful of as well, because we've had some questions recently about our antiquated and outdated fees. We also see some additional Hancock provisions built out further in state law in Chapter 27. Importantly, it discusses that the term increasing as an increasing revenue does not include adjustments that are necessary to maintain funding of a service program or activity in existence at the time when the voters approved the Hancock Amendment, or that's been approved by a vote of the people since that time. So there is a bit of flexibility built out in state statute about how Hancock can operate. And then another limitation and parameter that's also come into the public eye in the past year or so is what's called the public purpose test. And generally speaking, the Constitution across a few different chapters does say that anytime the city expends revenue for a purpose, it really does have accrue or expend revenue. It does have to be for the public purpose. So some important limitations about what that is and isn't. We really have to be mindful of not expending aid for any corporation except as narrowly provided in the Constitution. Lending our credit or granting money or property to a private individual, association, corporation, again, except as provided in the Constitution. There are a few exceptions as well for things like pensions, that make a bit of sense in industrial projects that we see authority for elsewhere. But generally, when you think of public purpose, it is a bit of a common sense test. It's for the benefit of the people, all of the people. And so a few takeaways from that landscape before we move on to the next is there really are a lot of different ways that the city can think about generating revenue, but there are a lot of specific provisions governing those, most notably when it comes to taxation that are found in the state constitution and state law. There's also some limitations in terms of how we can expend them and for what, again, that public purpose. On the debt front, there's different kinds of debt that can be levied for different purposes and in partnership with different individuals. And as a safeguard, a lot of revenue generation vehicles do require voter approval. Not all of them do, but that is something to be thinking about in terms of long-term recommendations is screening for, would this need to be something that has to go through our board, to be recommended to get to a vote of the people. So just a few things to be thinking about. Moving on to our state landscapes, that's a landscape of our constitution and laws as they currently exist. Of course, the General Assembly is getting ready to come back and do its thing in January. And so thought it would be helpful to take a look at what that is looking like right now. The Missouri legislature is generally vested with two duties. The biggest one prescribed under the state constitution is their duty to pass an annual balanced budget. So that's one. And there can be opportunities for local governments to do a little bit of that revenue sharing, cost sharing with the state or otherwise benefit through that. And the other duty of the legislature, of course, is to change state law. They can allow or prohibit local governments from broadening or changing their laws. And of course, they can also present ballot measures to voters that can impact city municipal revenue. Looking at the Missouri budget, the state has revenue sources that are fairly similar to that list that we just reviewed for municipalities in terms of where does their money come from. They can levy taxes, they can levy fees, they can have certain kinds of very special taxes that create special funds for special programs. They can also issue debt. So there's really not a ton that's different at the state level. It's just they have a little bit more authority to do a lot more things than municipalities generally do. When we look at the budget landscape right now, it was for fiscal year 25, the current fiscal year, pretty big budget, just shy of 50.5 million. A lot of that came from general revenue. And as a regional note, we had more than 1 million employees in 2023 in our region, making up about 35% of employment. So that's a lot of income revenue that this region is generating. Regional employment also increased 1.4% from 2022 to 2023. So again, when we're thinking about the importance of the work of this council, we do have a regional impact on the state's budget. So just something to be aware of and mention. The state also gets federal funds, again, those other funds, those special fees and whatnot that go into certain dedicated special funds. And then the state is fortunate to be dealing with a very large budget surplus. So some of the state's budget came from that.
Casey, is this all millions or billions?
I'm so sorry. It's supposed to be a B, not an M. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Sam. I'll go ahead and update that. And then in ways that cities and organizations can go ahead and engage in the budget process, cities can receive direct appropriations in the state budget dedicated to them. Different organizations within cities can also receive appropriations. There are dedicated programs within the state budget that provide funding through programs that, while they don't specifically name the city, that we are certainly partners in and take advantage of as well. And the big picture revenue landscape is that the state's heading towards its first fiscal year right now with declining revenue in more than a decade. Projected 70 million, and that one is supposed to be an M, not a B. Projected 70 million decrease for the current fiscal year. And a big thing to note with this one is this is the first decline that's occurring during a growing economy in the state in a pretty long time. If you look at the fiscal analysts, you know, one of the points they'll stress is they think it's because last year was really such a huge year. It's hard to have that kind of growth duplicated another year. And because of that, they're tentatively projecting 1.6% growth in state revenue in fiscal year 26. But of course, the state landscape is a little bit uncertain. We're not sure how some of the tax cuts are going to shake out. So this is just the initial landscape. Again, this year, likely declining revenue, and we'll see moving forward. But while that is happening, it's also important to note that federal pandemic aid utilization, which has kept the state afloat and helped contribute to those large coffers, is beginning to wind down. The state is, of course, still working to program and implement its monies, but that cushion is not as flexible to help cover various needs in the state budget as has been the case in the past. So some potentially uncertain times ahead. And now a quick look at some of the broad level categories of legislation that could impact the city's revenue. Some of these are targeted towards policy across the board. Some are targeted towards cities. Some are targeted towards the city of St. Louis. So this is a pretty high level overview. So where something applies to the city, I'll make sure to indicate that. But certainly with all these, there is at least the potential for this to impact revenue in the city. There's an array of income tax bills that have been proposed that would undertake a variety of different tax. Some would further reduce, or I'm sure folks have seen the headlines of proposing an entire elimination of the state income tax, phasing out the corporate income tax, bills to create new deductions that could further reduce state income tax collections. Specific to St. Louis and Kansas City as currently drafted, there is legislation to exempt all taxpayers under a certain federal poverty level from the earnings tax, and a different approach to exempt individuals making under a certain amount of money from the city earnings tax as well. And then another one specific to the city of Kansas City and St. Louis would be a bill to divert earnings tax collected into opportunity zones. So not get rid of it, just change where it would go. There's a number of different sales tax bills. Sales tax bills have been pretty frequent vehicles in years past, and this is no different. It seems there's even a bit of an uptick in terms of filing this year, bills to target that. So there would be bills that would allow actually for local sales tax on products like electrical energy and gas to be levied through a vote of the people. There would be actually a bill that would allow cities and counties to increase any sales tax without authorization of the General Assembly, so long as it's done at a municipal general election. And then, of course, there would be bills to phase out or exempt local sales taxes on different kinds of products, food, diaper, incontinence, and feminine hygiene products. Legislation to increase the cigarette sales tax, allow a new sales tax for special educational purposes, allow voters to approve local energy use sales tax exemptions. There's one that would require the withholding of sales tax to any taxing entity if the Attorney General determines that taxing entity, such as a city, has violated the law or the Constitution. And then there would be a new one to require the General Assembly to impose a statewide sales tax and lobbying services. Property tax bills, of course, are seeing a lot of interest as well. They typically do. There's a variety of approaches we're seeing that mirror prior year approaches, providing a new tax rate ceiling that was enacted during a temporary levy would, once that temporary levy expires, that tax rate ceiling would go away and everything would revert back to the original rate. Changing the cap and the inflationary growth for assessment of property, reducing assessments on certain populations like seniors and disabled persons, providing for a new property tax for special ed services. That one is specific to the city of St. Louis. Replacing real property with a sales tax entirely and to nearly eliminate personal property tax. That one would leave us with 0.3% rate. And then, of course, there's other bills that could have a financial impact on the city as well. Multiple bills have been filed, once again, providing for a state takeover of the SLMPD. A common feature of these pieces of legislation is requiring a certain amount of individuals to be employed as law enforcement officers, a certain number of positions on the force. There is legislation that would be the second and final step to fully implement the repeal of the reforms of the city's fire pensions. The board did phase 1 earlier this year and overwriting a veto of that bill. So that was phase 1. And the passage of the state legislation would be phase 2 for that to take effect. There's another piece of legislation that would require the public school retirement system to increase employer contribution rates. This one, of course, isn't controlled by the city, but of course that would potentially have, an impact on local revenue in other ways. And then there has been a piece of legislation filed to allow for the taxation of certain higher education institution endowments, including those located in the city of St. Louis. So some big things to consider. Last year, not a lot got done at the state legislature. It was a pretty contentious environment, a lot of infighting, a truly small number of bills filed. It does seem that this year there is some momentum going to legislative session. We'll see if that translates into meaningful difference in terms of the climate, but some signs are there that it could be a different year where things don't stop just because of political dysfunction, that there has been some coalescing around folks wanting to do some sort of tax rollback or tax repeal or whatnot. So that's the thinking going into session right now is it will be a bit more productive than prior years. And looking at the large state budget surplus, that certainly seems to be fueling that conversation. A lot of folks who see the state sitting on that thinking, well, now is in fact the time, let's go ahead and, cut things a little bit and tax less. And then, of course, looking at the state, the landscape of all the bills filed, there's going to be a lot of pieces of legislation that would create fiscal challenges for all local governments, not just St. Louis. And then there are some that we would have to specifically deal with that others would not as well. So certainly shaping up to be quite an interesting session already. And then a few other pieces to touch on, some of which we've already discussed a little bit. Of course, the earnings tax, the city has been in the process of implementing the court decision from earlier this year to provide refunds for remote workers. As of October, I know that the initial estimate of refunds at that point in time was about 18.3 million and expected to grow significantly per the collector's office. It is my understanding that that figure has increased quite a bit. So, the implications for the city's revenue, I think are pretty notable and something to keep an eye on, further lends some credence to the need for the city to develop some different strategies for revenue creation. At the same time that earnings tax refund landscape is creating a bit of uncertainty, should the state legislature also pass that phase 2 of the local fire pension bill, that would, moving forward, potentially create some additional cost concerns as well for the city. The prior legislation was enacted as a way to get costs under control. So while it certainly wouldn't be, like a 50 million hit year one, the anticipation is it is, local pensions, and that would be an increased cost and would change some things moving forward. And then, of course, there's uncertain federal landscape. You know, I don't think anybody knows exactly what to expect with the forthcoming administration, but certainly there would be some changes that we can anticipate in the federal landscape in terms of federal funding programs, in terms of the tax structure. There's been a lot of conversation about tariffs, and it's, you know, nothing has been finalized, of course, but certainly a bit of uncertainty is what we can see coming down the pipe at the federal level. Okay, I think that's it. I know that was a lot of information, so wanted to see who might have any questions. And let's see, Ryan, I think you were the first hand I saw. And thank you, Lorenzo, for that reminder.
Thanks, Casey. That was a pretty robust presentation. I appreciate that. My first question, I have just a couple that I jotted down, goes back to Article 10, Section 3, where it talks about the requirement for the taxes to be uniform on the same class or subclass of properties. Would that preclude then a separate or different rate for vacant land versus land with improvements? And then I guess it's sort of a two-parter. This might go to Mr. Dauphin, the assessor. I'm not even sure if we changed that, if that would increase our net revenue anyway, and it may just shift who pays it. So that's sort of a two-parter there I have.
Sure. I think it's a great question. I'm going to kick it over to Michael, Assessor Dauphin, to kind of talk about how we think about the different assessment classes. Assessor Dauphin, you want to share some insight?
Sure. And Ryan, I was listening, but I missed the very beginning part of your question.
Oh, sure. Just would a vacant land tax, would that be precluded by Article 10, Section 3 that requires uniform rates on the same class or subclass? I'm not sure if that means if vacant can be considered a different class or not.
You're saying if we just slapped a fee for any property that was sitting vacant, like if there's kind of like a uniform fee or a designation where, okay, if these, yeah,
you're getting at the idea. Yeah.
I would have to see what that language looked like to see if it would violate, but at the end of the day, it sounds like it might. But I would hate to say that there's no way that we can make that work. I think you just have to be pretty crafty with the language. And I haven't looked it up. I'm just going from my gut and off the top of my head. There may be something in place that would, some kind of mechanism that would allow us to do that. But
and then
go ahead.
So then on the second part, I'm not sure if you caught that, but on the second part is, even if that was allowed, would that even allow us to increase our net revenue, or does that just sort of shift the burden, which could be good, because if it prompts folks to develop their property, that would have other revenue effects. But I'm just curious if we're prevented, if like the ceiling that we have would prevent that from increasing the net that we get.
The ceiling, what ceiling are you referring to?
Well, I believe there is a limit on the max levy that we can apply.
Yeah, okay. And your question is, if we put this designation on all the vacant land and collected on them, would that impact the ceiling for the debt levy?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, that's what
I'm saying. I don't know that off the top of my head. That'd be something I would ask Sean Ordway. He might know that off the top of his head, but he's not in right now. But I can look into that one.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
I just have one more, Casey, and then I'll let someone else chime in. And I assume I know which way they're thinking, but you mentioned that one of the legislative proposals this year is for changing the cap on inflationary growth for property tax estimates. I assume that well, I don't want to assume. Does that mean raising it or lowering it, or are there propositions for both ways?
It would be allowing for a few different ways of calculating it. Hang on, let me see if I can pull up the bill. It's essentially, it puts forward if inflation, if the inflationary adjustment is not large enough, there's a separate calculation. It's the larger of the two that would be taken into account when you're considering property assessments. I can go ahead and pull that for you off the top of my head. I don't know what the other, like what that or is, but I'd be happy to pull that and share that.
Sure. Yeah, and I mean, you could just let me know the bill, the bill. I didn't notice that one, and I mean, I could look that up offline also.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Sam, go ahead.
Thanks, Casey. And good presentation all around. Could you or any of the city officials on the call here talk a little bit more about fees, and specifically if you all have done any kind of assessment of which of the city's fees are kind of the most archaic, haven't been touched in the longest time, and may be ripe for some review and potential adjustment.
Sure. I'm happy to take a first stab at this, and I'll kick things over. What's going on? I'm seeing Nancy shake her head.
I think Paul's getting ready to speak, which might be helpful. Not that you don't know, but since he's the institutional guru here, he's shaking his head too, because they are all antiquated.
Yeah. Well, yeah,
Oh.
go ahead, Paul, and I'm happy to talk about the work that the fellow we had did too. Oh, Paul, for whatever reason, we can't
It's
hear you.
M&M's, so you have to wait a minute
Oh, he's eating M&Ms. Oh,
or something.
yeah, we can't hear you. While he's doing that, I will generally share, Sam, that we had a wonderful Coro fellow with our office this fall who did quite a good bit of research on the landscape of fees, compile a nice database in terms of the last time they were updated. And we also had him do a CPIU inflationary adjustment to see what those would be like looking at the difference between them when they were first enacted and now. So the answer is yes, there are quite a few that have been antiquated, and we do have, thanks to that fellow, a nice initial starting point to kind of go through and start considering them. I know Paul was gracious enough with his time with the fellow to help inform that project. Let's see if he's got volume yet. Paul, there might be a dial-in link, maybe. I don't know if that's an option for you to at least get vocal capability.
Yeah, while we're waiting on Paul to join, in case, do you think that research the fellow did is something that can be shared with the council?
Yes, and in fact, it was one of the projects he took on specifically to try to not just benefit the city, but also support the council should that be a direction the council wanted to explore a little bit more. So absolutely, there was a lot of intentionality behind that. So happy to make that available and put together a nice one-pager to show folks where some of the trends are in that. Well, while Paul is working on that, did anyone else have any questions or thoughts or any requests for follow-up on any of the items presented? I know it was quite a bit of information.
Casey, I had one question on the number of legislative, I guess, different bills and things that have been brought up. I'm curious on if the city team has had any indication, or is the most concerned, or does one have more traction over another, that as we're thinking about revenue options, we should just have top of mind if we're prioritizing the number of things that seem to be sort of in the mix right now from a legislative perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. Early indications are that in terms of, the tax related bills, there certainly seems to be a lot of coalescing around the idea of doing something with the income tax. Now, whether it's the complete elimination of it or, further implementing some of those or escalating some of the existing revenue triggers to reduce it, or, providing for additional triggers beyond what's currently baked in there. Certainly, oh, great, okay. Paul, do you have the ability to unmute, or is it something STL TV may need to do? Let me see. While we're sorting that through, I think certainly something on the income tax front just seems to be an early winner for that reason. You've got, let's see, got it. STL TV, if you would be able to see if we can help get Paul Payne unmuted, that'd be great. But yeah, there's just a lot of momentum building right now among that, among something income related. I think it also, there's the corporate income tax. I think that's a bit of a sleeper that could see a bit of momentum to additional reduction in that. Again, it's one of those, economic business adjacent, ones that it's been a few years since that one was touched. And so there's been, typically when that happens, people try and think, okay, well, there's not been much done in recent years. So let's go ahead and see what we can do there. And then I could also see, I don't know which sales tax exemption, but there's been a few vehicles that have gotten farther and farther and farther along each year. One of the big ones that's gotten a lot of momentum has been the exemption on food sales tax. And that, of course, has implications for a lot of local revenue streams, revenue for our schools. So I think that's a big one to keep an eye on, too. It just, like I said, it keeps on getting a little bit farther every year in the process. So I would say that those on the tax front would be some of probably the leading candidates for the time being. On the earnings tax front, I know that a lot of folks in legislature mostly just wanted to see the court process play out and this, whatever that decision was, for that to be implemented and move forward. So that is in fact what's happening. I don't know if that. I think early indications are, by and large, most of the folks that we have visited with the Missouri legislature over the years on that, seem to think, well, that's, what we asked for, you guys have followed through. So that may mean that some of the additional bills filed, that there's a little less perception of need for those, momentum for those. But those are also, income adjacent. And since the attitude is very something to do with income tax and do something with income tax, we can't certainly, write those off. So yeah, I would say on the straightforward revenue ones, I think smart money says something will get done this session. Likely, a little bit with income, probably something with sales tax, but who knows? It could turn into another completely wild dysfunctional session. I think it'd be hard to beat last year, frankly. Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's any others off the top of my head. I think also it's not one, again, that directly impacts the city's revenue, but certainly impacts city taxpayers, where there has been some interest we've heard in the legislation to reform the local public school pension system. It's gotten some coverage for being a bit underfunded. So there has been a bit of interest in trying to right size that and require more employer contribution, which of course, could have, revenue implications for your average taxpayer here. So that's another one I think to keep an eye on as well.
Thanks,
Nancy, go ahead. Yeah.
I
Oh,
was-
sorry, Danielle, were you?
The
I'm sorry,
food one is
Danielle, go
related-
ahead.
Oh, sorry. The food one is just related to groceries, or are we talking about it's just grocery? I just want to clarify.
There's different flavors of it. It's at point of sale and retail. So the way it's currently worded, like the intent would be to apply it just to, grocery purposes. But there is a twist on it out there that could potentially apply to broader food purchases. But I think it's most likely because the version that's moved forward, because the version that has moved forward pretty relentlessly has been the one that's grocery targeted, that the language in that other vehicle probably would be tightened up. It's unclear if that's intentional, just because most of it is grocery forward, so I would assume it would stay there. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Nancy.
Mhm.
I just wanted to ask Mark if he had an update. The update I have from the collector of revenue on the earnings tax was about 36 million and change. As my last number, is it up to 38 now, or is 36 pretty much it?
Yeah, no, I mean, we've still got a significant amount of returns that still need to be processed. They're waiting on documentation, follow-ups and whatnot. So, I mean, my expectation is it's going to get to that 40 million cap, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, but I think it's certainly going to get there. What we're hoping to have is I think everybody's been contacted, and if not, they'll be contacted by the end of this week. That starts a 30-day clock for anybody who hasn't been contacted. So obviously we'll get through December. We'll have a little bit into January, but by the end of the January, we'll know the full figures. And then we've been kind of working on analysis based on location of employees, where they were coming from, socioeconomic background as far as dollars and cents, and then certainly sectors. So we'll have a little bit more information to go from after that. What we're encouraged by, and encourage is maybe the wrong word, but what we're looking at is the trend is certainly, as each year went by, we're seeing further reductions in the amount of refunds we're sending out. So I think things are returning more or less back to a more in-house centric approach to working. You're still going to see hybrid approaches from remote work, and certainly Paul and I have had the discussion. Is that going to change how employers do withholding? And so are we going to get a more true figure, whereas they'll stop holding it 100% and then we're sending money back, and that they're going to accurately send us in what they're withholding, and therefore we won't see as many refunds. So we'll have a truer number to pull from at the beginning of the year, as opposed to at the end when we're trying to figure out what everything's been paid in or out.
Thank you.
Yep.
Paul, do you have audio capability? Let me see. Hang on. I have asked to unmute the phone that I believe to be you.
Not sure he's looked at my messages.
Paul, do you have any messages in the Zoom chat?
Hello, hello. Okay, there we go. Jeez. All right. Let me pull up screen. Share.
Maybe your computer or something, you got a little feedback going on.
All right. Can you see my screen right now?
Yes.
Okay. This is the exhibits I presented to you in the first meeting. And
maybe everybody can
mute,
because sometimes I see that.
And what I like, oh geez, a lot of feedback. Is that? Can you hear that, or is it just me?
Yeah, we can hear it.
You need to turn off the speakers on your computer while you're talking.
There you go. Yeah.
Okay. There you go. All right. What I was going to do is expand these. No, cancel. Expand account description.
Hey, Ryan, can you mute? Maybe see if you can see if that helps.
Mute on my. Okay. Anyway, you can see the detail by account. This is not going to work. Yeah, this is not. This is going to be painful. But let me stop sharing. Let me if you can hear it. Basically, the big fees from our general fund budget are the building fees, EMS revenues, city court fines and forfeits. Those are the big ones. And the building division fees have been adjusted regularly. All right, are you hearing this background? Okay, well, I'm not going to continue this. This is too painful.
How about if you shut your computer off and just be on by phone?
I could try that too.
Mute the speakers on your computer. Just mute the
still
speakers
there?
on the computer.
Yes.
Yeah, we're still
Can you hear
here.
me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, great. All right. The big service fees are building division fees, court fees, and refuse fees, and items such as those. Building division fees get adjusted periodically, and the ones we have not adjusted, although it's more sensitive, is the refuse fees. So the last adjustment we made on that was back in 2017. So that's been a number of years, and that is not particularly keeping up with the cost of our refuse costs. City court fines and forfeitures has declined over the years as the parameters of what's being charged there has declined as well. In the building division, as I mentioned, those fees have been adjusted periodically, and it's driven largely by the building activity that we see in the city. In the recent years, that's been good, although in the last year, perhaps a year and a half, we've seen declines in that area as well. And then the other area I mentioned were EMS fees, which we try to adjust periodically. I would have to, public safety would have to provide some information on when the last time those were adjusted. We typically try to keep within range of the neighboring jurisdictions when it comes to EMS transports. Those are the biggest areas where we're going to see revenues in the general fund on fee-based revenues. There are other ones, whether it's park use permits and things like that, but once you get into those smaller categories, it has much less impact on your overall general fund revenue.
And Paul, thank you for that, Paul. And are those fees under the control of the Board of Aldermen, or what is the process for adjusting those?
Most of them are done by ordinance. So, for instance, on the refuse fee, it was implemented. There was the initial implementation, and then we had one adjustment back in 2017, and that's the last one. That was done by ordinance. Also, with the building division, those fees are set by ordinance as well. The only requirement, and this alludes to the provisions under the statute, is that the cost of the service, the fees themselves cannot exceed the cost of the service. So when establishing those, for instance, both with refuse as well as building and EMS, the cost of providing the service still exceeds that of the revenue generated by the fees we charge.
And is there a considerable gap there?
It's growing. The most impactful one would probably be the refuse fee. I know no one likes to talk about that too much, but that one's several million off where it would recapture what the cost of the service is.
Got it. Thank you very much for that.
Sure.
And Paul, I was wondering if you could provide some context to the figures that Mark Stoff updated us on with the earnings tax in light of, what that means for the city's current fiscal year, just to help us contextualize it with the understanding that, it's great news that year after year that number has been decreasing. Love to hear that. But if you could just contextualize that in terms of what it what that may mean for the current fiscal year and things we're thinking about, down the line in light of that. I think that would be helpful.
Okay. Well, let me go back to the beginning when we were planning for this year's current fiscal year FY25. If you recall, there was a number, and we utilized in the this is going back to April when the budget was presented. This is before the court case was resolved, and we didn't know what to expect. In the budget, I incorporated a reduction of $26 million in both earnings and payroll tax receipts, and that was projected, basically of which $21 million was the earnings tax, about $5 million of the payroll tax built into the budget. We didn't know what the result of the court case would be, but that was on a prospectively going forward basis, what we might potentially lose as an estimate going forward. It was identified as an estimate of 2/3 of the individual portion of the tax. And if you recall from my presentation, just under 80% of the earnings tax is paid by individuals. So it's not 2/3 of the total tax, but 2/3 of that individual portion. So that was the assumption going in. Now, once the court case was decided, and subsequent to that, there was a decision to go back 3 years in refunds. And so that was going to surpass that which included in the budget, and so that's what we've seen. And as Mark, I may have been messing with my audio at the time, but I think Mark may have told you that the most recent numbers we've got with interest in refund amounts and interest payments have totaled over $36 million in the earnings tax and about $2.5 million in the payroll tax. So we do expect to see pressure on our revenues this fiscal year. It all depends on where we end up on the expenditure side. But going forward, then the question remains, what is that value on an annual basis can we anticipate? And as Mark could tell you, I think the best notion that we would have is that we still have some refunds that are going to be due. Again, that $36 million amount was for refunds from 20, 21, and 22. And we also anticipate refunds for the calendar 23, and yet those aren't due until April of next year. That would probably be our best measure of what this would be on an annual basis, because as you can tell, the earlier years would have been more severe because that's when the years of the pandemic. 23 a little bit more normalized. So I'm expecting that to be give us some guidance on what we might expect on an annual basis for that to be. But again, just looking, if there's any positive here, is that you've seen the 20 and 21 were the worst years, 22 a little bit fallback. We don't know what it's going to be 23, and so the question is going to still out there about what the annual cost would be. But in planning purposes, anything between 10 and $20 million would probably be something that you would be looking at on an annual basis to identify alternative revenue sources for.
Great, thank you for that, Paul. I think that was really helpful context and just illustrating the scope of, what we're dealing with here on that issue. Okay, any other questions or thoughts that folks would like to share?
I have a question. I think this will be a maybe Paul and Ryan question. So going back to what you said, Casey, about the anticipated bills that may or may not pass and impact the revenue of the city, do we do a like a net revenue calculation for any potential bills or legislation that comes up? And is that done, I guess, closer to the inception of that bill, or just once it comes on the radar? And if so, because I think if we're looking at long-term revenue, just understanding what those potential net cash flows are going to be for the city would be helpful.
Yeah, and Paul, I'm happy to kick it.
Yeah, I can sort of help jump in on those.
Sure.
Just to let you know, and while Casey mentioned them, and there's just a handful of there. In the reality, what we do is we get a request for fiscal notes in abundance. I would say they get into the hundreds, and we respond to those which come in. The reality is that while we may see hundreds of these bills come in, most don't see the light of day, and ultimately, but then they get more in the limelight at the end, near the end of the session. And as was apparent this year, there were a number that, for instance, on the earnings tax and then sometimes with the sales tax, we get these bills. There's a flurry of activity getting estimates in there, and then nothing happens. So while there are a number of proposals out there that would significantly affect our revenues from a negative standpoint, I don't know if necessarily the efforts of this committee would be, hey, we have to address something that might occur in that vein, and that I think in some respect would be spinning our wheels, because you see a lot of things that are proposed that never really go. From our standpoint, what we'd like to do is be able to identify those that actually get committee hearings and proceed through the legislative session so that everyone's informed on them. And then, but yeah, I don't know, Casey. I think that preparing on the IFCOM is a bit like chasing our tail, and just seeing that from my experience and how these things go.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, one thing that if this group would find it helpful, what we could do is we can very easily pull one of the fiscal notes for, by way of example, the food sales tax exemption legislation from last year, and share that we did provide analysis for. It's all public. So, we'd be happy to pull that from the leading vehicle from last year so folks can see, what that information provided looked like. And, while the income tax bills this year are a little bit different than they have been, in the years past, if there's an example or two that seem like they could be on point or illustrative, happy to provide those as well. Yeah, Ryan? Oh, you're on mute.
Okay, thanks, Casey. Well, I'm sorry to see that Sam just left, because what I was going to say is, while I don't disagree with what Paul said about chasing our tails with trying to figure what might pass and what might not pass, those on the call that have lobbying arms, it would be helpful to help us out. I know the Missouri Municipal League has taken a pretty firm stance against the sales tax on food elimination. And I was going to ask Sam if Greater St. Louis had taken a position on that or not. But I may just shoot him a note. So any of you with lobbying clout, that might be helpful while outside the parameter of this council.
And then just so I'm clear, just so I can track down a decent set of examples. So certainly an example of the fiscal note from prior, food sales tax exemption, one on the income tax reduction front. Were there any other pieces of legislation that folks might find it helpful to see some of the prior information provided by the city? Well, you know where to find me if something occurs to you and you find yourself staying up late tonight thinking, gosh, I wish I had a lot of drill down detail on the impact of this.
Yeah, and I'll just clarify my question too, and thanks for the answer. The answers were perfect, and I know we usually do that fiscal note, but what I didn't know was just how much in advance or how anticipatory we are with that. So and it makes sense, a lot of bills and ideas don't necessarily go forward, but when we know like this is gonna be a thing, because just thinking about the things that we'll be doing and putting forth, if we know that in April 2025 that we calculate a net positive for the city of 25 million due to whatever strategy put in place, and then a bill goes forward in June that decreases that or increases that, it would just be good to, well, probably decrease, but decreases that, it'd probably be good to know what's in the pipeline. So yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, and happy to, as this group moves forward, I mean, with the start of the legislative session, of course, keep our pulse on that and make sure that's part of the conversations in the months ahead. If something seems like it's getting them at 10, making sure that you guys are aware of that for recommendation purposes too. Nancy, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I don't think that all the fiscal notes that go through the Board of Alder people are necessarily completely accurate, because sometimes once you start putting something into play, things cost more than people initially realize. Sometimes they go in without a fiscal note. You have a couple things that passed last year that had no fiscal note, and the actual cost doesn't seem like a lot, but it's like almost $15,000 to $20,000 a year. And there's no budgeting for that. It's not anywhere in the bill. It's not Ryan's fault, but sometimes they're not putting a fiscal note on, or they're not putting a fiscal note that's realistic with what the costs would actually be. It's a philosophical, nice thing to do, but it's extremely costly for the city. And also, I'd like to see at some time what other cities have done to try and bring in more revenue, because I think that's part of what we need to be doing, is figuring out, we budget based on how much money and Paul can correct me on this, but what we think is coming in, but we don't necessarily budget on what we think we need to run the city. And I think those are two different things, and that we need to be looking at that a little more, and then looking at all of the tips, and I've said this before, the abatements, the tips, and all of the other funds. I'm not saying that they're not necessary, but I do think we need to know how much revenue eventually is that bringing back into the city. Because if they end up bringing a lot of long-term revenue, then definitely we should figure out how we're utilizing that source. But those are things that everybody wants to stay away from. But I've lived here for 20-something years, and if we don't figure that out, it doesn't matter. We have to figure out how we're bringing more revenue in bigger forms without more taxes on everybody that lives here. As Casey said, we can't control the taxes from the state. We can try, but we're only one part of the state. But long term, we do need to figure out how we fund a city and run a city efficiently, and where is all that income coming and revenue coming for us to be able to do that. So that's just my little soapbox.
That's a good one. Yeah. And I think, so I know the briefing topic for next month is on a little bit more targeted focus on that, on what are other cities doing. And Danielle, I know that you had offered to lend your expertise as part of that. So that's really wonderful that we'll have a bit of a enhanced focus, for the start of the legislative session at the state level, at least, in terms of, okay, what strategies have other cities applied that may work. So, yeah. Okay.
Casey, are we gonna get to a point where we have narrowed down sort of the strategy, maybe the 3 or 4 pronged strategy? I know we will, I'm just kind of guessing the timeline here. The strategy of what we're gonna eventually propose, like it may be, it's, well, I don't know, whatever they look like, yeah, I don't know what they look like. I was gonna say reduction in tax, and then whatever the other one's, reduction in fees, or whatever, or increase in fees, reduction in tax, whatever that 3 or 4 or 5 pronged approach is to raising revenue long term. When do we anticipate getting to that point where we're gonna start developing those ideas?
Sure. Yeah. So Chair Boyd called me before the meeting today, and we talked a bit about that. Just given topic wise, it seems like a lot of the big picture information gathering in January. That'll be a nice point to really coalesce around, focusing a little bit more on that. What he has tasked me with doing is working with him and the vice chair to kind of put together, going through the minutes and the notes, a running list of here are things that this group found as being, preliminary takeaways that seem to draw a little bit of attention, and sharing that with you all and seeing what additional questions that might spark leading into January. But timing wise, I would anticipate, just based on the conversation today with him, for that to be a shift that starts to happen in January, following that presentation about city modernization of revenue. So yeah, planning wise, probably prepare for that to be the shift in focus then.
Great.
Great. And on that note, you can expect another round of fun scheduling emails from me with more availability polls for January, February, and March. So just please be mindful of those. I'll try to get this out this week so we can clear through it before the holiday season. And it's one less email that's just kind of hanging in your inbox that you don't really want to deal with. So we'll get that out to schedule those out, and we'll get those all noticed up. Yeah, before we kick it over to someone to make a motion to adjourn, is there anything else anybody wants to bring forward? Okay, well, thank you for your time. I know this was a pretty wonky one today. And having said that, is there a motion to adjourn?
I make a motion to adjourn.
Is there a second?
Second.
Second. Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Great. See you, no opposition. Thank you all for your time, and have a wonderful and safe holiday season if I don't see you before then.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, Casey.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.